On June 6, 1963, in a Greenwich Village bar in New York City, a man named Charles Edward Terry was arrested for the murder of 62-year-old Zenobia Clegg. Faced with police questioning, Terry confessed to the Clegg case in full detail, describing how he strangled her with her own scarf and sexually assaulted her with a liquor bottle. Terry's confession was detailed and specific. The Clegg case seems to have been closed, but Thomas Kavanagh Jr., the officer who arrested Terry, when examining the details of the Clegg case and Terry's background, found some details that linked him to the Boston serial murders. Back then, a string of killings had been terrorizing Greater Boston. 13 women had been murdered, and the killer was known as the Boston Strangler. Thomas noticed that Terry often went to Boston on weekends, and those times lined up almost exactly with the first 6 murders. His methods were strikingly similar to the Stranglers too. If it's your first killing, you're so pumped up on adrenaline and scared that you're not going to stick around and do anything, much less decorate the body. On the evening of May 30th, 1963, a man and a woman walked into the lobby of a hotel near Times Square. The man was in his early 30s. The woman with him was old enough to be his mother, a scarf tied around her neck. In the early hours of the morning, they returned to their room, and shortly after, the front desk received a call from the woman asking a bellhop to bring up a bottle of whiskey. That was the last time anyone saw Zenobia Clegg alive. Not long after, a maid came by for the routine cleaning, but when she entered Clegg's room, she found it ransacked. Clegg lay on the bed, her eyes half open, her mouth slightly agape, her face bruised from blows, her body covered by a bedsheet. After hotel staff called the police, officers arrived at the scene, pulled back the sheet, and found her legs spread, posed naked in a sexual manner, her scarf tied around her neck in a tight bow, and a pear placed beside her right leg. The autopsy revealed even more. The victim hadn't been raped in the conventional sense. She had been sexually assaulted with a liquor bottle, and although the room had been torn apart like a robbery scene, her jewelry and cash were still there. To catch the killer, police used a criminal profile. Based on multiple witness descriptions, they pieced together a portrait of the suspect, a tall, gaunt young man. Then, on June 6th, after a bartender tipped them off, Kavanagh led several officers into a Greenwich Village bar and arrested the suspect, 34-year-old Terry, a Maine native, high school dropout, former Marine, dishonorably discharged for stealing a car, and after his release, he raped a woman and got 8 years. In prison, a psychiatrist's assessment labeled him a smart antisocial with sadistic sexual tendencies. At 6'5", Terry matched the sketch perfectly. What made it even more certain was that he was carrying a gold cigarette case engraved with Clegg's name and $600 in traveler's checks. Kavanagh himself handled the interrogation. After a full night of questioning, Terry laid out the day of the murder in detail. He said that Clegg had approached him in the street, asking for directions. They chatted a while and decided to have a drink at a hotel. The alcohol kicked in, the mood shifted, but during the time, Clegg mocked him for being impotent. That was the trigger. He beat her half to death, then strangled her. The Clegg case was closed. However, after reviewing all the evidence from the murder and digging into Terry's background, Kavanagh noticed some disturbing details. Terry's methods bore an uncanny resemblance to the first 6 Boston Strangler killings. The victims were the same age group, all strangled with their own clothing and tied in bows, their remains posed in provocative, degrading positions, most sexually assaulted with foreign objects. The crime scenes ransacked, but nothing taken. 55-year-old Anna Sleezers was widely considered the Boston Strangler's first victim. On June 14, 1962, she was found dead in her Boston apartment, her body arranged half-naked, sexually assaulted, a bathrobe belt wrapped around her neck and tied in a bow. Her room had been ransacked, but her valuables were still there. 14 days later, 85-year-old Mary died of a heart attack caused by the shock of being sexually assaulted. 2 days after that, in Boston, 68-year-old Nina was found dead on her bedroom floor, her house dress pulled below her waist, strangled with nylon stockings while 2 more were tied in a bow around her neck, and sexually assaulted with a liquor bottle. That same day, in Lynn, 65-year-old Helen was found face down on her bed, her nightgown pushed to her shoulders, sexually assaulted and strangled with nylon stockings. A brassiere was wrapped around her neck, with the ends tied into a loose bow just below her chin. On August 19th in Boston, 75-year-old Ida was manually strangled after being sexually assaulted, a pillowcase bound around her neck. The pattern was glaring. Elderly women, strangulation, bows, foreign object sexually assaulted, staged break-ins with nothing stolen, almost identical to what Terry had done in New York. In the interrogation room, Kavanaugh asked Terry if he had ever been to Boston. Terry admitted he had on weekends. When Kavanaugh checked the dates, they lined up almost exactly with the first 5 murders, and the day Terry arrived in New York, the 6th victim was found. When the news reached Boston, John Donovan, the then chief of homicide unit, was in New York within hours. He wanted to question Terry about the Boston serial murders, but Terry refused to talk. After that, Kavanaugh put together a research team with some retired detectives and his son Brian to keep investigating the Boston killings and find evidence linking Terry to at least some of them. Later, 2 of team members, James Mackin and James LaCorlo, went up to Boston specifically for this. They dug through boarding house registers and found Terry's name, and 2 of those addresses were just a few blocks from the murder scenes. But just as Kavanaugh and his team were getting ready to expand the investigation, Boston police stepped in. Worried about media attention, they threw Kavanaugh's people out of the city and made it clear they had zero interest in what his team had found. Over the following decades, a man named Albert DeSalvo came forward and claimed to be the Boston Strangler. For a while, both the public and the police thought the case of the man who killed 13 women was closed. But he was never formally tried for these murders. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for a series of unrelated assaults. And while his confession was detailed, it did not match the content of some cases. Even more suspicious, in 1973, just as he was about to recant his confession to a New York Times reporter, he was stabbed to death inside the prison. The real physical evidence, DNA, did not surface until many years later, and it only proved the connection between him and Mary, the final victim. So the question becomes whether one man could actually have committed all the crimes pinned on the Boston Strangler. Look at the differences between the cases. The early victims were mostly elderly women living alone. The scenes carefully staged, bows, posed remains, ransacked rooms. But the later victims were much younger, the methods cruder, more direct. For a typical serial killer, their modus operandi would not undergo such a fundamental and sudden change. A lot of people believe it. Even some of the victims' families, there was never one Boston Strangler. Those killings were likely the work of multiple killers, and Terry was very probably the real killer behind the early ones, because his methods line up perfectly with the early murders. John Spencer, a Fort Lauderdale psychiatrist and expert in sex-related crimes and killings, said, "If it's your first killing, you're so pumped up on adrenaline and scared that you're not going to stick around and do anything, much less decorate the body." But Terry, he killed Clegg and then calmly arranged her body, sexually assaulted her with a liquor bottle, tied a bow, even placed a pear beside her. And in 1951, shortly after Terry's release from prison, a 24-year-old woman in Brunswick named Shirley Coulin was reported missing. Her body was found in a garden, a scarf tied around her neck, because of death strangulation. In 1958, he got out again. That same June, 29-year-old Patricia Wing was murdered in a wooded area in Oakland. A man named Savage was charged at the time. But plenty of people believed Terry was the real killer. He was living in Oakland, right where the victim was. And during his 1963 interrogation, himself brought up killings in Brunswick and Oakland. Kavanaugh and his son spent their entire lives trying to prove Terry was one of the early Boston Strangler killers. But in their efforts to solve these cases, they ran into heavy resistance from Boston police. And with DeSalvo locked in as the official culprit, their theory never made it past the stage of strong suspicion. As for Terry's ending, after his 1963 conviction, he was first sentenced to death in the electric chair, then had it commuted to life imprisonment at Attica in New York. There, he went silent. He never spoke about any case again. Then on April 15, 1981, he died in prison from a pulmonary embolism.